Some folks believe your worth is measured by how others treat you. Clara Mae Dunning learned that wasn't always true the hard way. It was 1887 in Sweetwater, Wyoming, and the harvest dance was the biggest night of the year. While the town's finest danced inside the hall, Clara scrubbed horse stalls out back for 75 cents a week. Her family once owned half the valley, but now she cleaned up after her former friends. The music played through the barn walls as she worked on her knees in the muck. Then expensive boots appeared in the doorway. Beau Callahan, the richest man in 3 counties, stood there in his finest coat. He could have any woman at that dance, but he walked straight to Clara and knelt down beside her in the dirt. What would make the most powerful rancher in Wyoming risk everything for a hired girl? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Mae. Dunning's story didn't begin in a stable, though that's where most folks in Sweetwater figured it would end. 3 years earlier, she'd been the belle of every social gathering from Cheyenne to Laramie, her father's cattle empire stretching across 40,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Wyoming territory. The Dunning name opened doors, commanded respect, and guaranteed her a seat at the head table of any function worth attending. But money has a way of disappearing faster than morning frost when a man puts his faith in the wrong people and his signature on the wrong papers. The autumn of 1884 brought more than an early winter to the Dunning Ranch. It brought Marcus Whitmore, a smooth-talking businessman from Chicago, with promises of expanding their cattle operation into new markets. He spoke of railway contracts and government beef orders, painting pictures of wealth that would make their current fortune look modest. Thomas Dunning, Clara's father, had built his empire through careful calculation and honest dealing. But approaching 60 with a bad heart and mounting pressure from younger, more aggressive ranchers, he found himself listening to promises that sounded too good to ignore. Clara remembered the night her father signed those documents, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he set pen to paper in their mahogany-paneled study. She'd been reading by the fireplace, only half listening to the men's conversation, when something in the tone made her look up. Her father's face had gone pale, and Whitmore was already reaching for his hat. "Papa?" she'd asked, but Thomas Dunning just stared at the papers scattered across his desk like fallen leaves. Within 6 months, it became clear that Marcus Whitmore's railway contracts existed only in his imagination, and his government connections were nothing more than elaborate fiction. The money Thomas had invested, nearly everything they had, vanished along with Whitmore himself. Worse still, the loan documents Thomas had signed to finance the expansion contained clauses that even their family lawyer called creatively vicious. The bank came calling in spring of 1885, and by summer's end, the Dunning Ranch belonged to a consortium of investors led by the very men who had once tipped their hats respectfully to Thomas at church every Sunday. Clara watched from the front porch as strangers inventoried their cattle, their horses, even the furniture her mother had brought from Boston as a bride 25 years earlier. Thomas Dunning didn't survive to see autumn. The heart that had carried him through decades of harsh winters and harder business dealings simply stopped one September morning as he sat watching the sunrise from what had once been his land. Clara found him there, peaceful in his chair, with her mother's letters from their courtship days spread across his lap. The funeral drew a respectable crowd, though Clara noticed how few of their former friends met her eyes during the service. Sympathy had a way of drying up when scandal touched a family, and there was plenty of talk about Thomas Dunning's poor judgment and reckless speculation. The women who had once competed for invitations to Clara's tea parties now whispered behind gloved hands about the tragedy of the Dunning girl, while their husbands calculated how to divide the remaining assets. Clara's inheritance amounted to $47, a trunk of her mother's belongings, and a reputation that had soured faster than milk left in the sun. The cottage where she'd been permitted to stay temporarily belonged to the new ranch owners, and they'd made it clear that their charity wouldn't extend indefinitely. That's how Clara Mae Dunning, who had once received marriage proposals from the sons of senators and cattle barons, found herself accepting a position as general help for the Sweetwater Community Association. The job paid 75 cents a week, plus meals, and it came with a small room above Henderson's general store that smelled perpetually of coffee and leather goods. Her daily routine had become a catalogue of small humiliations. She cleaned the schoolhouse every morning before the children arrived, tended to the church between services, and maintained the community buildings that hosted the very social functions she'd once helped organize. The harvest dance represented the pinnacle of her degradation, spending the evening scrubbing out horse stalls while her former peers celebrated inside. But Clara had learned something about herself during those 3 years of watching her world collapse and rebuild itself around her absence. She'd discovered that dignity didn't depend on other people's recognition, and that honest work, however humble, carried its own form of honor. Her hands might be calloused and her dresses simple, but she met each day with her spine straight and her conscience clear. The worn leather gloves she wore had belonged to her father, one of the few items she'd managed to keep when the estate was settled. They were too large for her slender hands, but wearing them connected her to memories of riding beside him across their land, learning to judge cattle and read weather signs. Now they protected her skin as she performed tasks he'd never imagined his daughter would need to do. Beau Callahan represented everything Clara had lost and everything she couldn't allow herself to want. At 32, he commanded respect through ability rather than inheritance, having built his cattle operation from a single homestead claim into the most profitable ranch in 3 counties. Unlike many of the established families, he'd earned his position through relentless work and shrewd decisions that never crossed the line into exploitation of others' misfortune. Clara had watched him from a distance during her father's decline, noting how he'd been one of the few prominent ranchers who hadn't participated in the feeding frenzy when the Dunning assets went up for sale. There had been speculation about his reasons. Some suggested he was too proud to benefit from a neighbor's misfortune. Others believed he was simply too busy expanding his own operations to bother with acquiring distressed properties. The truth, had Clara known it, was more personal than either explanation suggested. Beau Callahan had been present the night Thomas Dunning signed Marcus Whitmore's papers. He'd been invited to the meeting as a potential partner in the expansion, his younger operation seen as a perfect complement to the Dunning Ranch's established markets. But something about Whitmore had struck him wrong. Perhaps the man's eyes moved too quickly when discussing specifics, or his answers to direct questions contained too much elaborate detail. Beau had excused himself from the meeting without signing anything, citing the need to study the contracts more carefully. He'd spent the following weeks trying to verify Whitmore's claims, but the Chicago businessman had covered his tracks with professional skill. By the time Beau had confirmed his suspicions, Whitmore had vanished and Thomas Dunning's fate was sealed. The guilt of not preventing his neighbor's destruction had weighed on Beau ever since. He'd considered approaching Thomas directly with his concerns, but what proof could he offer beyond instinct and suspicion? A man's reputation and a family's future deserved more substantial evidence than bad feelings about a stranger's smile. Now, 3 years later, he found himself standing in the doorway of a stable, watching Thomas Dunning's daughter scrub floors while music and laughter drifted from the building where she should have been dancing. The injustice of it had been eating at him all evening, and the whiskey he'd consumed trying to ignore his discomfort had only sharpened his focus on what needed to be done. Clara sensed his presence before she looked up, some instinct warning her that her solitary evening was about to be interrupted. When she saw those expensive boots and the hem of a formal dress coat, her first assumption was that one of the town's prominent men had come to complain about some inadequacy in her work. She'd learned to expect criticism rather than praise, since finding fault with the hired help had become a popular pastime among people who'd once considered her an equal. But when she raised her eyes and recognized Beau Callahan, confusion replaced resignation. He had no reason to seek her out, no cause to leave a comfortable party for a conversation with someone the town had collectively decided to forget. The expression on his face suggested purpose rather than casual encounter, and something in his steady gaze made her heart beat faster in a way she hadn't experienced since before her world collapsed. "Miss Dunning." Beau's voice carried that particular tone men used when they'd made a decision that couldn't be undone. Clara had heard it before, from bankers, lawyers, and the men who'd come to inventory her father's belongings. She remained on her knees, scrub brush suspended over the wooden planks that had absorbed years of hay dust and horse sweat. "Mr. Callahan, I trust you're finding the evening's entertainment satisfactory." "Can't say I am." He stepped into the stable, his formal shoes making soft sounds against the straw-scattered floor. "Seems like the finest company is out here instead of in there." Clara resumed scrubbing, focusing on a particularly stubborn stain near the water trough. "I'm certain Governor Patterson's daughter would disagree. I heard she's quite accomplished at the piano." "Piano playing is a fine skill." Beau moved closer, and Clara could smell the expensive soap he used, mixed with the whiskey on his breath and something else, leather and sage that reminded her of riding across open range. "But it doesn't tell you much about a person's character." "And you believe scrubbing stables does?" The words came out sharper than she'd intended. 3 years of careful politeness had worn thin tonight, perhaps because of the music floating through the walls or the way her knees ached from kneeling on hard wood. "I believe honest work reveals more about someone than dancing ever could." Clara sat back on her heels and looked up at him properly for the first time. His formal wear was impeccable. Black wool coat tailored to his broad shoulders, white shirt with pearl studs, string tie secured with a silver clasp. But his dark hair showed signs of having been raked by his fingers, and those brown eyes held something she couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or determination. "Mr. Callahan, if you're here to offer charity, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm managing quite well on my own." "This isn't about charity." He moved to the wooden rail that separated the stalls and leaned against it, studying her with uncomfortable intensity. "It's about justice." "Justice?" Clara laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Justice would be my father seeing through Marcus Whitmore's lies. Justice would be those contracts being written in plain English instead of legal trickery. Justice would be the men who profited from our misfortune having the decency to look me in the eye when they passed me on the street." "You're right about all of that." Beau's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle. "But sometimes justice comes later than we expect, and from directions we don't see coming." Clara studied his face, searching for whatever game he was playing. In her experience, powerful men didn't seek out conversations with hired help unless they wanted something specific, and they certainly didn't discuss abstract concepts like justice while expensive music played 50 feet away. "What do you want, Mr. Callahan?" "I want to tell you something about the night your father signed those papers." The scrub brush slipped from Clara's fingers and clattered against the floorboards. She'd never spoken to anyone who'd been present that evening, had only heard second-hand accounts from lawyers and bankers who'd dealt with the aftermath. Her father had died without explaining his decisions, and she'd been left to piece together the story from legal documents and whispered conversations. "You were there. Marcus Whitmore invited me as a potential partner, said the expansion could benefit from including a younger operation with different market connections." Beau's hands gripped the rail tighter. "I listened to his presentation, read through the initial proposals, and something felt wrong." "Wrong how?" "Too perfect. Too many guarantees for ventures that should have carried significant risk. And Whitmore himself, he had answers that came too quick, details that sounded rehearsed." Beau pushed away from the rail and began pacing the narrow space between stalls. "I told him I needed time to review the contracts, verify the contacts he claimed to have." Clara's chest tightened as understanding began to dawn. "You didn't sign?" "No. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to verify his claims about railway contracts and government connections. Found nothing. By the time I'd confirmed my suspicions, Whitmore had disappeared, and your father had already committed everything. The stable fell quiet except for the distant sound of fiddles and the soft movement of horses in their stalls. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach as the full implications of what Beau was telling her became clear. "You knew," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You knew it was fraud, and you didn't warn anyone. I had suspicions, not proof, and by the time I had enough evidence to matter, it was too late to matter." Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady after kneeling for so long. "My father trusted that man because other respectable ranchers were willing to work with him. If I'd spoken up without proof, Whitmore would have adjusted his story and found another way to accomplish the same thing. Men like him always do. So you stayed quiet and let it happen. I made a choice I've regretted every day since." Beau stopped pacing and faced her directly. "I told myself I was being prudent, protecting my own interests first and worrying about my neighbors second. I told myself your father was experienced enough to recognize a bad deal when he saw one. But he didn't. No, he was tired, worried about competition from younger ranchers, and Whitmore was very good at what he did." Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here, not in front of him. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I can't change what happened, but I can change what happens next." "And what exactly do you think happens next, Mr. Callahan?" Instead of answering, Beau reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, and sealed with red wax. He held it out to her. "What is this?" "A way to get your life back." Clara stared at the envelope as if it might contain a snake. "I don't want your pity money." "It's not money. It's an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Beau set the envelope on the rail between them. "The kind that requires you to trust me, even though I've given you reason not to." Clara looked from the envelope to his face and back again. "You're asking me to trust the man who could have prevented my family's destruction but chose not to?" "I'm asking you to trust the man who spent 3 years trying to figure out how to make it right." The music from the dance had shifted to something slower, more melancholy. Clara could hear couples moving across the floor, their feet keeping time with melodies that had once filled her own life with joy and possibility. Now those same songs felt like echoes from someone else's existence. "Open it," Beau said softly. Clara picked up the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. The wax seal bore initials she didn't recognize. JMH inside was a single sheet of paper covered with official-looking text and several signatures. She read it twice before the words made sense. "This is a deed." "Yes, to the old Morrison Ranch. 5,000 acres, plus mineral rights and water access." Clara looked up at him, confusion replacing anger. "I don't understand. James Morrison defaulted on a loan 6 months ago. The property went up for auction last week. And you bought it." "I bought it." "Why?" "Because it borders your family's old land. Because it's good grazing territory with year-round water access. Because it's the kind of place where someone could build a life worth living." Clara stared at the deed, her mind struggling to process what he was suggesting. "Mr. Callahan, I couldn't possibly. The property needs a manager. Someone who understands cattle, knows the territory, and has the kind of backbone required to make tough decisions. The position pays $200 a month plus housing." $200? Clara felt dizzy. That was more than she currently earned in a year. The job comes with full authority over ranch operations and a percentage of profits after the first year. Beau's voice had taken on a businesslike tone, as if he were discussing weather or grain prices. "There's also a clause allowing the manager to purchase the property at a reduced rate after 5 years of successful operation." Clara set the deed back on the rail with careful precision. "What you're describing sounds less like employment and more like partnership. Eventually. Why would you offer this to me?" Because you're Thomas Dunning's daughter. Because you know cattle and land management. Because you've proven you can handle adversity without losing your integrity. And because you feel guilty about not warning my father. Beau nodded slowly. That too. Clara picked up her scrub brush and bucket, needing something to do with her hands, while her mind raced through possibilities and complications. This is too much, Mr. Callahan. Too generous, too sudden, too much like the chance your father would have given someone else in similar circumstances. The observation hit her like a physical blow. Thomas Dunning had been known throughout the territory for giving second chances to people who'd made honest mistakes, for helping neighbors recover from bad seasons or poor decisions. He'd believed that a man's future mattered more than his past, and he'd acted on that belief consistently until his own future was stolen by someone who didn't share his values. I need time to think. Of course. But Clara. The use of her first name made her look up sharply. Don't let pride make this decision for you. Pride is a luxury you can't afford right now. Is that what you think this is about? Pride? I think you're afraid that accepting help makes you weak, when the truth is exactly the opposite. Clara moved toward the stable door, carrying her cleaning supplies. I should get back to work. The floors won't finish themselves. Leave them. I can't. Mrs. Henderson expects you to clean floors because that's what she's paying you to do. But tonight, you're not Clara Mae, the hired help. Tonight, you're Thomas Dunning's daughter considering a business proposition. Clara stopped walking and turned back to face him. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, you decide who you want to be. Beau straightened his coat and moved toward the door. Keep the deed. Read it over carefully. If you have questions, find me. And if I decide I'm not interested, then you tear up the paper and continue your life as it is. No obligations, no expectations. He paused in the doorway, his tall frame silhouetted against the light spilling from the dance hall. But Clara, your father would have wanted better for you than this. He'd have wanted you to have the chance to rebuild what was taken from you. Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone with a scrub bucket, a legal document, and a choice that would determine the direction of the rest of her life. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat by the small window in her room above Henderson's store, watching shadows shift across Main Street while her father's brass compass spun slowly in her hands. The deed lay spread across her narrow bed, its official language both promising and threatening in the lamplight. Thomas Dunning had given her the compass on her 16th birthday, explaining that it had belonged to his own father during the push west from Missouri. A Dunning always knows which direction they're heading, he had said, closing her fingers around the worn metal, even when the trail gets rough. Now the needle pointed steadily north toward the Morrison Ranch, 5,000 acres of rolling grassland that represented either salvation or another kind of trap. By dawn, Clara had read the deed so many times she could recite the legal descriptions from memory. The terms were exactly as Beau had described, generous to the point of seeming fictional. No established rancher offered such opportunities to hired help, especially not to women whose families had fallen from grace. Which meant either Beau Callahan was exceptionally charitable, or he wanted something from her that hadn't been spelled out in their conversation. The first person she encountered after breakfast was Mrs. Henderson, who noticed immediately that Clara's cleaning supplies remained exactly where she'd left them the previous evening. Floors don't scrub themselves, the older woman observed, her voice carrying that particular tone of disapproval reserved for hired help who forgot their place. And I distinctly remember asking you to have the stable area spotless before this morning. Yes, ma'am, I'll finish it right after. You'll finish it now. The mayor's wife specifically commented on the condition of those stalls when she dropped off her horse last week. Said they smelled like a working ranch instead of a proper community facility. Clara bit back her first 3 responses, all of which would have pointed out that stables were supposed to smell like horses. Of course, Mrs. Henderson, I'll see to it immediately. But as Clara gathered her supplies and headed toward the community building, she found her steps slowing with each yard she covered. For 3 years, she'd accepted these small humiliations as the price of survival. She'd nodded politely when former friends criticized her work, smiled when they discussed her family's failures within her hearing, and pretended not to notice when they acted surprised that someone of her background could perform manual labor competently. This morning, with Beau's offer burning in her pocket like a live coal, those same humiliations felt different. They felt like choices rather than inevitabilities. The stable still smelled of expensive cologne and whiskey from the night before. Clara knelt beside the water trough where she'd abandoned her scrub brush. But instead of resuming her work, she found herself remembering the weight in Beau's voice when he'd spoken about justice coming from unexpected directions. Clara? The voice belonged to Sarah Mitchell, one of the few women in Sweetwater who still acknowledged Clara's existence beyond professional necessity. Sarah had been Clara's closest friend before the world shifted, and while their relationship had necessarily changed, she'd never participated in the collective decision to pretend Clara had become invisible. "Sarah, you're up early." "Couldn't sleep after the dance. Too much excitement, I suppose." Sarah moved into the stable, her morning dress practical but well-made. "I heard Beau Callahan caused quite a stir by disappearing halfway through the evening. Some say he was feeling poorly, others think he had business matters to attend to." Clara resumed scrubbing, keeping her eyes on the floorboards. "I wouldn't know about that." "Of course not. You were working." Sarah's tone suggested she'd heard more than she was admitting. "Though I did notice someone had lit a lamp in here quite late. Mrs. Patterson mentioned seeing light from the stable windows when she stepped outside for air." The scrub brush paused in Clara's hand. Sarah was fishing for information, which meant the story of Beau's departure had already begun growing legs around town. By noon, there would be a dozen different explanations for why the territory's most eligible bachelor had abandoned a dance filled with suitable women. "People see all sorts of things when they're looking for gossip," Clara said carefully. "Indeed they do." Sarah settled herself on a hay bale, clearly intending to make a proper conversation of it. "Clara, I know things have been difficult since your father passed. I know people haven't always been kind. People have been exactly what I expected them to be, which is human." Clara sat back on her heels and met her friend's eyes directly. "When fortune smiles on you, everyone wants to share in the warmth. When it turns cold, they find other fires to huddle around." That's a rather bitter perspective. It's an honest one. Sarah was quiet for a moment, studying Clara's face with the intensity of someone trying to read meaning in familiar handwriting. What would you do if circumstances changed, if opportunity presented itself? The question was too pointed to be casual curiosity. Clara set down her brush and gave Sarah her full attention. "What have you heard?" "Nothing specific, but small towns have sensitive ears, and when a man like Beau Callahan spends private time with anyone, people notice. And what exactly do people think they noticed? A conversation between two people who used to move in similar circles. A conversation that lasted longer than politeness required, and ended with him giving you something." Clara's hand moved instinctively toward the pocket where she'd folded the deed. "You saw that?" "Mrs. Patterson saw it. She was taking air on the back porch when Beau left the stable. Said he looked like a man who'd just made an important decision. Mrs. Patterson sees what she wants to see. Usually, yes. But this time I think she saw something real." Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper. "Clara, if Beau Callahan has offered you some form of employment or assistance, you need to be very careful how you proceed." "Careful how?" "Careful not to let pride prevent you from accepting help you need. And careful not to accept help that comes with expectations you can't meet." The warning was delivered with genuine concern, but it still stung. "You think I'm incapable of handling whatever proposition he might have made? I think you're perfectly capable of handling any legitimate business arrangement, I also think you're inexperienced with men who have the power to make or destroy reputations based on their personal satisfaction with how situations develop. Clara resumed scrubbing with more force than the stains required. Are you suggesting Beau Callahan is the type of man who would abuse his position? I'm suggesting that any man with significant wealth and influence has options that other men don't, and that sometimes those options create situations where a woman's intentions are less important than her circumstances. You're warning me about accepting his offer. I'm warning you to understand exactly what you're accepting before you commit to anything. Beau Callahan has a reputation for fair dealing, but he's still a man who's used to getting what he wants. Clara stood up, gathering her cleaning supplies with deliberate calm. Sarah, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not the naive girl who used to ask your advice about ribbon colors and dance partners. I've learned to evaluate situations for myself. Yes, you have. You've also learned to be suspicious of kindness, and sometimes that's not entirely helpful. The observation hit closer to the truth than Clara wanted to acknowledge. 3 years of reduced circumstances had taught her to question every gesture, every offer, every conversation that seemed too generous to be genuine. She'd become expert at identifying the small cruelties people inflicted when they thought their targets couldn't retaliate, but she'd also become skeptical of genuine kindness when it appeared. "What would you do?" Clara asked. "In my position, with my options, what would you do?" "I'd find out exactly what he's offering and exactly what he expects in return. I'd get everything in writing, with witnesses if possible. And then I'd make a decision based on what was best for my future, not what felt safest in the present." Sarah stood up, smoothing her skirts. "But most importantly, I'd remember that sometimes the biggest risk is not taking any risk at all." After Sarah left, Clara finished cleaning the stable in thoughtful silence. The work went quickly without conversation to distract her, and she found herself standing in the doorway looking north toward the Morrison Ranch before the sun had climbed halfway to noon. The compass in her pocket pointed steadily in the same direction, its needle unwavering despite the uncertainty in her heart. Clara found Beau at the Cattlemen's Association office 3 days later, though finding him required more courage than she'd anticipated. The building sat on the corner of Main and 3rd Streets, its brick facade and brass nameplate declaring the wealth and influence of its members. Clara had once attended social functions in the meeting room upstairs, but walking through the front door as a petitioner rather than a peer felt like crossing into foreign territory. The clerk at the front desk, a thin man named Phillips, who'd once competed for her attention at church socials, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed surprise. "Miss Dunning, how may we assist you?" "I'd like to speak with Mr. Callahan, if he's available." Phillips glanced toward the stairs leading to the upper offices. "Mr. Callahan is reviewing quarterly reports with the territorial representative. Perhaps you could state your business, and I'll determine if it warrants interrupting their meeting." The condescension in his voice was subtle but unmistakable. Phillips was enjoying the opportunity to act as gatekeeper between Clara and someone she needed to see, savoring the reversal of their former social positions. 3 years ago, he'd brought her punch at dances and complimented her dress. Now he was deciding whether her concerns merited consideration. "Please tell him Clara Dunning needs 5 minutes of his time regarding the Morrison property." Philip's eyebrows rose slightly at the mention of specific business, but before he could respond, Beau's voice carried down from the 2nd floor. "Phillips, send Miss Dunning up, and bring coffee for 3. I suspect this conversation will take longer than 5 minutes." Clara climbed the narrow staircase, her practical boots making sounds that seemed inappropriately loud in the hushed atmosphere. The upper floor smelled of leather, pipe tobacco, and the particular mustiness of rooms where important men made decisions that affected other people's lives. Beau's office occupied the corner of the building, its windows providing views of both Main Street and the rolling hills that marked the beginning of serious ranch country. He sat behind a mahogany desk that had probably cost more than Clara earned in a year, but he stood immediately when she entered. "Clara, I wasn't certain you'd come." I wasn't certain either, until this morning. The territorial representative proved to be a compact man in his 50s with shrewd eyes and a carefully groomed beard. He introduced himself as James Morrison, not the same Morrison who'd lost the ranch, but his uncle who'd inherited the responsibility of managing the family's remaining assets. "Miss Dunning," Morrison said, extending his hand. "Beau's told me about your situation. I knew your father by reputation, a fair man and an honest dealer." "Thank you, sir. I understand you're considering taking on management of my nephew's former property." Clara looked between the two men, realizing this meeting had been planned in advance. Mr. Callahan indicated there might be an opportunity, but I wanted to discuss the specifics before making any commitments. "Sensible approach." Morrison gestured toward the chairs arranged in front of Beau's desk. "Please sit. Let's discuss those specifics." Phillips arrived with coffee service on a silver tray, his movements precise and deferential in the presence of men whose opinions mattered to his continued employment. Clara noticed he avoided making eye contact with her, as if acknowledging her presence in this setting would somehow compromise his professional standing. After he left, Morrison spread several documents across the desk's surface. The Morrison Ranch encompasses 5,300 acres of mixed grazing and hayland, with year-round water access from Willow Creek and its tributaries. The property includes a main house, foreman's residence, bunkhouse for 12 men, and all necessary outbuildings. Clara studied the survey maps and property descriptions, noting details that would have escaped someone without her background. "What's the current cattle capacity?" 800 head, comfortably, perhaps 1,000 during good years with proper pasture rotation. "And the condition of the grazing land?" Beau answered this question. "My nephew was more interested in immediate profit than long-term sustainability. Some areas will need time to recover from overgrazing, but the basic land is sound." "How many hands are currently employed?" "None," Morrison said bluntly. "When the property reverted to family ownership, we released all employees rather than continue operating at a loss. The buildings and equipment are maintained, but there's no active ranch operation." Clara set down her coffee cup, processing the implications. So whoever takes this position would be starting from nothing. No cattle, no crew, no established routines. Which is why the compensation is substantial and the eventual ownership opportunity is genuine, Beau added. "This isn't a position managing someone else's established operation. It's an opportunity to build something from the ground up. With what capital? Cattle and equipment cost money, and good hands don't work for promises." Morrison smiled, the first genuine warmth he'd shown since introductions. "There's a reason Beau recommended you specifically, Miss Dunning. Most people focus on the challenges without recognizing the advantages. Such as complete autonomy over hiring, breeding, and operational decisions. No interference from distant owners or established procedures that may not suit current conditions. The chance to implement modern techniques without having to overcome tradition and resistance." Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out over the town where she'd once been welcomed and was now merely tolerated. "And if the operation fails? If drought or disease or market conditions make success impossible? Then you return to your current circumstances with 3 years of management experience and a reference from the territorial representative," Beau said quietly. "But if it succeeds, I own 5,000 acres of prime ranch land and have proven I can rebuild what was taken from my family." "Exactly." Clara turned back to face them. "What aren't you telling me? This arrangement is too generous for simple business purposes and too complicated for charity. What's your real motivation?" Morrison and Beau exchanged glances before Morrison answered. "My nephew's failure wasn't entirely due to poor management. He was systematically cheated by the same group of men who defrauded your father, using similar techniques but over a longer period." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. "Marcus Whitmore. Whitmore was part of it, but not the leader. The organization is based in Denver, with connections to railroad interests and territorial political figures. They identify successful ranchers facing temporary difficulties, offer assistance that seems legitimate, then use legal technicalities to acquire properties at fraction of their true value. And you think giving me this ranch will somehow address that problem? I think putting this property in the hands of someone who understands their methods and has personal reasons to oppose them serves multiple purposes. Beau said, "You get the chance to rebuild your life. We get a manager we can trust completely, and if certain Denver businessmen ever target this ranch again, they'll discover they're dealing with someone who won't be fooled twice." Clara returned to her chair, her mind racing through implications and possibilities. "You're not just offering me employment, you're recruiting me as an ally in a larger conflict. We're offering you the tools to fight back against people who've already hurt you once," Morrison corrected. "Whether you choose to use those tools for anything beyond building a successful ranch operation is entirely your decision." Clara looked down at the deed she'd been carrying for 3 days, its official language now taking on new meaning. This wasn't just about managing cattle and hiring cowboys. It was about positioning herself to confront the forces that had destroyed her family with resources and support she could never have assembled alone. "I need guarantees," she said finally. "Legal protections, clear authority, and the right to withdraw if circumstances change in ways that compromise my safety or integrity. Of course. And I want to review the original documents related to your nephew's difficulties. If I'm walking into someone else's battlefield, I need to understand the terrain." "Already prepared." Morrison indicated a thick folder at the edge of the desk. "Everything we know about their methods, their associates, and their typical procedures." Clara picked up the folder, feeling its weight both literally and symbolically. "When would you need an answer?" "Take as long as you need," Beau said. "But Clara, don't let fear of the unknown keep you trapped in circumstances you've already outgrown." As she prepared to leave, Morrison added one final observation. "Your father would be proud to see you considering this opportunity. He always said the measure of a person wasn't how they handled success, but how they responded when success was stolen from them." Walking back through Sweetwater's dusty streets, Clara clutched the folder against her chest and felt her father's compass spinning gently in her pocket, its needle pointing toward a future she was finally ready to consider. Clara spent the following week reading through Morrison's files with the methodical attention her father had taught her to apply to breeding records and land surveys. The documents revealed a pattern of sophisticated fraud that made Marcus Whitmore's deception of her father look almost simple by comparison. The Denver operation worked like a slow poison, establishing relationships with successful ranchers over months or even years before moving to acquire their properties. They offered legitimate services initially: legal advice, banking connections, market information, building trust while carefully documenting any vulnerabilities in their targets' operations. When circumstances made a rancher susceptible to outside assistance, the organization provided solutions that seemed perfectly reasonable. Emergency loans during difficult seasons, partnerships to expand into new markets, legal representation during boundary disputes, all delivered by respectable professionals with impressive credentials and flawless references. The trap closed through carefully crafted legal documents that contained clauses invisible to anyone lacking specialized legal training. Loan agreements that shifted ownership upon default, triggered by impossibly precise conditions. Partnership contracts that gave operational control to silent investors. Legal settlements that required collateral far exceeding the actual damages involved. James Morrison Jr. had lost his ranch through a combination of all three methods, spread across 4 years of escalating financial entanglement. The final blow came when a boundary dispute with a neighboring ranch, itself owned by the Denver organization through a shell company, required legal resolution that put his entire property at risk. Clara found her father's name mentioned twice in the files, both times in connection with invitations to participate in cooperative. ventures that he declined for reasons the documents didn't specify. His instinct for honest dealing had apparently protected him until Marcus Whitmore presented an opportunity too attractive and too urgent to permit careful investigation. The most disturbing discovery came in a letter dated 6 months before her father's death, warning him that his financial difficulties had attracted attention from investors seeking opportunities in distressed agricultural properties. The letter, signed by someone identified only as a friend in Denver, advised Thomas Dunning to be extremely cautious about accepting assistance from unfamiliar sources. Her father had never mentioned receiving such a warning, but Clara found his response draft among the papers Morrison had somehow obtained. Thomas had written back requesting more specific information about the threat, but there was no indication he'd received a reply. The implications were staggering. Someone in Denver had known her father was vulnerable and had tried to warn him. Someone else had made certain that warning arrived too late to be useful. Clara closed the folder and walked to her small window, looking north toward the Morrison Ranch. The property sat like a chess piece on the board of a game she was only beginning to understand. Accepting Beau's offer would place her in direct confrontation with forces that had already proven they could destroy established ranches with decades of experience. But it would also give her resources her father had never possessed, advanced knowledge of their methods, legal protection through territorial connections, and most importantly, partners who understood the true nature of the conflict. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. Clara opened it to find a young man she didn't recognize, well-dressed but nervous, holding an envelope bearing her name in unfamiliar handwriting. "Miss Dunning, I'm Robert Chambers, Mr. Whitman's clerk. I have a message for you." Clara accepted the envelope, noting the expensive paper and formal presentation. "Mr. Whitman," of Whitman, Sterling and Associates, the law firm. Chambers shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Whitman asked me to deliver this personally and to wait for your response, if you choose to provide one." Clara had never heard of the law firm, but something in Chambers' manner suggested the message was significant. She opened the envelope and read its contents twice before the meaning settled in her mind. The letter was brief and professionally formal. Whitman, Sterling and Associates had been retained to represent certain parties interested in acquiring properties in the Sweetwater area for development purposes. They understood Clara might be considering accepting a management position at the Morrison Ranch and wished to inform her of alternative opportunities that might better serve her long-term interests. If she was available to discuss these opportunities, Mr. Whitman would be pleased to meet with her at her convenience to explain how she might benefit from arrangements that would provide immediate financial security without the risks inherent in ranch management. Clara folded the letter and studied Chambers' face. "How did Mr. Whitman learn I was considering the Morrison position?" "I'm sorry, Miss Dunning. I'm only instructed to deliver messages, not discuss how they're composed." "Of course. Please tell Mr. Whitman I appreciate his interest, but I'm not currently seeking alternative opportunities." Chambers looked surprised. "Are you certain? Mr. Whitman specifically asked me to emphasize that time may be a factor in these arrangements." "I'm certain." After Chambers left, Clara remained by her door for several minutes, turning the letter over in her hands. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Within days of learning about the Morrison opportunity, she was being approached by unknown parties offering unspecified alternatives. She found Beau at his ranch that afternoon, working with a group of cowboys to separate cattle for winter feeding. He saw her approaching and handed his rope to one of his men before walking to meet her at the corral fence. "You look like someone who's received interesting news," he observed. Clara showed him the letter from Whitman's firm. Beau read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "When did this arrive?" "This morning. A clerk delivered it personally." "Robert Chambers." "You know him?" "I know of him. He works for a Denver law firm that specializes in property acquisition. The fact that he's here means someone considers your decision important enough to warrant immediate attention. Clara gripped the fence rail tighter. They already know about the Morrison offer? Apparently so. Beau folded the letter and handed it back to her. This confirms what Morrison suspected. They're monitoring situations in this area very closely. What kind of alternative arrangements do you think they're offering? The kind that would remove you as a potential problem while appearing to provide benefit. Probably employment in Denver or another territory, with enough compensation to make relocation attractive. And if I refuse? Then they'll try other approaches. Pressure, intimidation, or legal complications that make accepting the Morrison position impossible. Clara turned to watch the cowboys working cattle, their movements practiced and efficient. These men trusted Beau's judgment and depended on his success for their own livelihoods. Accepting the Morrison position would make her responsible for similar relationships, while simultaneously painting a target on her back. Beau, are you absolutely certain this is about more than just ranch management? I'm certain they killed my cattle last month. The words hit Clara like cold water. What? 18 head found dead in Red Canyon, no apparent cause. The territorial veterinarian said it looked like poison, but he couldn't identify the specific agent. Beau's voice had gone flat, professional. It happened 2 days after I started asking questions about Morrison's financial difficulties. You think they were warning you to stop investigating? I think they were demonstrating their willingness to escalate beyond legal maneuvering if necessary. Clara felt her knees go weak. The abstract threat posed by legal documents and financial manipulation had suddenly become concrete and deadly. Beau, I can't. Yes, you can. He turned to face her directly, his brown eyes steady and determined. Clara, these people have already taken everything they can from you through conventional methods. What are you going to do? Spend the rest of your life hiding from them? I'm going to spend the rest of my life surviving. There's a difference. Surviving isn't living. Your father knew that, and he'd want better for you. Clara stared at the letter in her hands, its formal language suddenly seeming more like a declaration of war than a business proposition. If I accept the Morrison position, I become a threat they have to eliminate. If you accept the Morrison position, you become someone with the resources to fight back. There's a difference between being a threat and being a target. The distinction mattered, though Clara wasn't entirely certain she understood it yet. What she did understand was that remaining in her current circumstances offered no real safety, only the illusion of invisibility that could be shattered whenever someone found it convenient to do so. I need to think about this more. Of course, but Clara... Beau moved closer, his voice dropping to a private tone. Don't let them make this decision for you through intimidation. That's how they win. As Clara rode back toward Sweetwater, she realized the choice was no longer between safety and risk. It was between different kinds of risk and different ways of facing an enemy who had already declared war on everything she valued. The compass in her pocket spun freely as her horse navigated the rough trail, but when they reached level ground, its needle pointed steadily north. The decision came to Clara during Sunday morning service, though she hadn't expected divine intervention to arrive in the form of Reverend Patterson's sermon about David facing Goliath. She sat in the back pew where hired help was expected to place themselves, listening to familiar words take on new meaning as the Reverend spoke about courage being not the absence of fear, but right action despite fear. 3 rows ahead sat the prominent families of Sweetwater, the same people who'd profited from her father's destruction and who now treated her with polite indifference. Behind them sat the merchants and clerks who depended on those families' goodwill for their prosperity. And scattered throughout were the working people whose lives could be upended by decisions made in Denver boardrooms without their knowledge or consent. All of them were potential targets for the organization that had destroyed her family. All of them were vulnerable to the same sophisticated fraud that had stolen her inheritance, and none of them understood the true nature of the threat they faced. Clara realized she was uniquely positioned to protect them, Not because she was particularly brave or skilled, but because she'd already lost everything these predators could take from her through conventional means. She had nothing left to lose except her life, and she'd been half alive for 3 years anyway. After the service, Clara approached Reverend Patterson directly. "Reverend, I'd like to speak with you privately about a matter of conscience." Patterson was a thoughtful man in his 60s who'd known Clara's family for decades. He'd officiated at her parents' wedding and delivered her father's funeral sermon with genuine grief in his voice. Unlike many of his congregation, he'd never treated Clara differently after her circumstances changed. They spoke in his study while the rest of the congregation gathered outside for their weekly social hour. Clara explained the Morrison opportunity without revealing the deeper conspiracy, presenting it as a chance to rebuild her life through legitimate ranch management. "It's a significant risk," Patterson observed after hearing her out. "Ranch management requires skills you've never had to use professionally." "But skills I was raised with," Clara pointed out. "I know cattle, land management, and business principles. What I lack is experience making decisions that affect other people's livelihoods." "That's perhaps the most important skill of all." Patterson leaned back in his chair, studying Clara's face with paternal concern. "Are you prepared for that responsibility?" "I don't know if anyone can be prepared for it until they're facing it directly. But I know I'm tired of letting other people make decisions that affect my life without having any voice in the process. And this opportunity would give you that voice. It would give me the chance to prove I can be more than what circumstances have reduced me to." Patterson was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words carefully. "Clara, I've watched you handle adversity with more grace than most people half your age could manage. But management isn't about handling adversity. It's about preventing it when possible and guiding others through it when prevention fails." "Are you advising against accepting the position?" "I'm advising you to be honest with yourself about your motivations. If you're doing this to prove something to people who've already made up their minds about you, you're setting yourself up for disappointment. If you're doing it because you genuinely believe you can build something worthwhile, then you have my blessing and my prayers." Clara considered his words while watching dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the study windows. "Reverend, what would you do if you discovered someone was systematically cheating members of your congregation, but warning them might put yourself and others at risk?" "That's a rather specific hypothetical question." "Yes, it is." Patterson studied her face more intently. "Is there something about this opportunity you haven't told me?" Clara chose her words carefully. "There are aspects of the situation that involve matters beyond my personal circumstances. Matters that could affect other people in ways they don't understand." "And you feel responsible for protecting them?" "I feel responsible for not remaining silent when I have knowledge that could help them protect themselves." Patterson stood and moved to the window, looking out at his congregation members, engaged in animated conversations about weather, crops, and local gossip. "Clara, the desire to protect others is admirable, but it can also become a burden that destroys the person trying to carry it. Are you certain you're not taking on more responsibility than any individual should bear?" "I'm certain that someone needs to take responsibility, and I may be the only person in a position to do so effectively." "Because you have nothing left to lose?" The observation was gentler than it might have been, but it still hit Clara like a physical blow. "Because I have everything to gain by succeeding and nothing to fear from those who would prefer I fail." Patterson returned to his chair and leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he used when delivering particularly important spiritual guidance. "Clara, revenge and justice are not the same thing, though they can sometimes look very similar from the outside. I'm not seeking revenge. Aren't you? Even a little?" Clara met his eyes directly. "If seeking justice for what was done to my family happens to serve as revenge against those who did it, I'm not going to apologize for that satisfaction. As long as you remember that satisfaction fades, but the consequences of our actions remain long after the emotions that motivated them have passed." After leaving the church, Clara walked through Sweetwater's quiet streets, noting details she'd stopped seeing during 3 years of keeping her head down and her expectations low. The town was prosperous but fragile, dependent on agricultural success that could be disrupted by drought, disease, or economic manipulation from distant cities. The people she passed greeted her politely but without warmth, their manner suggesting they saw her as a fixture of the landscape rather than a person with agency and potential. They'd grown accustomed to thinking of her as someone to whom things happened, not someone who made things happen. That perception would work to her advantage if she accepted the Morrison position. People who underestimated her capabilities would be less likely to interfere with her plans or recognize her activities as threats to their own interests. By evening, Clara had made her decision. She found Beau at the Cattlemen's Association office, working late over territorial grazing reports by lamplight. "I'll take the position," she said without preamble. Beau set down his pen and studied her face. "What changed your mind?" "I realized I've been thinking about this wrong. I've been weighing the risks of accepting against the safety of refusing, when the truth is there is no safety in refusing. There's only the illusion of safety, and I've been living in that illusion for 3 years. And now? Now I choose to live dangerously rather than die slowly." Beau smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since their conversation began. "When would you like to start?" "Tomorrow. But first I want to see the ranch, meet with Morrison again, and review every legal document associated with the arrangement. If I'm walking into a war, I want to understand the battlefield completely." "Of course." Beau gathered the papers scattered across his desk. "Clara, you should know, once you accept this position officially, there's no going back to your previous life. Whether you succeed or fail, you'll have declared yourself an active participant in this conflict." "Good," Clara said firmly. "I'm tired of being a victim of other people's conflicts. It's time I started fighting my own battles." As she walked back to her room above Henderson's store for what she hoped would be the last time, Clara pulled out her father's compass. Its needle pointed steadily north, toward the Morrison Ranch and whatever future she was brave enough to build there. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like Thomas Dunning's daughter again. Clara's first week at the Morrison Ranch passed in a blur of inventory lists, repair schedules, and planning sessions that stretched from dawn until well past sunset. The main house was larger than she'd remembered from her childhood visits, with rooms that echoed emptily until she began filling them with the practical necessities of ranch management. Beau had been correct about the property's condition. The buildings were sound and the equipment well maintained, but the absence of active ranch operations was evident in overgrown pastures and fences that needed attention. Clara found herself making lists of tasks that would require months to complete, even with a full crew. The foreman's residence, where she'd chosen to live, was smaller than the main house, but perfectly suited to her needs. It came with a small office, a kitchen that could feed several people when necessary, and windows that provided clear views of the main approaches to the property. Clara appreciated the strategic advantages of the location, though she tried not to think too directly about why such considerations mattered. Her third evening at the ranch, Clara discovered something that changed everything she thought she knew about her father's death. She'd been organizing papers in the ranch office when she found a leather portfolio wedged behind a filing cabinet. The portfolio bore her father's initials and contained documents she'd never seen before, letters, contracts, and what appeared to be investigative notes in her father's careful handwriting. The first letter was dated 2 weeks before her father's death, addressed to him from someone signing himself J.H. Morrison, James Morrison, Jr., the man who'd lost the ranch. But this wasn't the defeated rancher Clara had imagined. This was someone who discovered the truth about the Denver organization and was trying to warn other potential targets. "Mr. Dunning," the letter began, "our mutual friend in Denver has confirmed that your recent financial difficulties have attracted the attention of the same group that engineered my downfall. They are moving faster than usual. which suggests they have reason to believe territorial authorities are becoming aware of their activities. Clara's hands trembled as she read the rest of Morrison's warning. He'd learned that Marcus Whitmore was merely a frontman for a sophisticated operation that included territorial officials, railroad executives, and federal land commissioners. They weren't just stealing individual ranches. They were systematically acquiring land for a railroad expansion that would make their backers wealthy beyond imagining. But the most shocking revelation came in her father's response, written in his own hand but never sent. "Morrison," her father had written, "I appreciate your warning, but I fear you underestimate their reach. My contact in the territorial government has informed me that Governor Patterson himself may be compromised. If we're to expose this conspiracy, we'll need evidence they can't dismiss or destroy. I'm prepared to play their game long enough to gather what we need, even if it means risking my own property in the process." Clara read the letter 3 times before its implications fully settled in her mind. Her father hadn't been tricked by Marcus Whitmore. He'd known it was a trap and had walked into it deliberately, hoping to gather evidence that would expose the entire conspiracy. The remaining documents painted a picture of careful planning and calculated risk. Thomas Dunning had been working with Morrison and several other ranchers to document the organization's methods, collect evidence of their illegal activities, and build a case strong enough to present to federal authorities. They discovered that the Denver Group's ultimate goal wasn't individual ranches, but control of a transportation corridor that would become invaluable when the new railroad lines were completed. Every property they'd acquired sat along the proposed route, and their coordinated efforts suggested knowledge of federal railroad plans that weren't supposed to be public information. Her father's final notes, dated the day before his death, indicated he'd arranged a meeting with a federal investigator who was secretly looking into territorial corruption. The meeting was scheduled for the morning after he died. Clara sank into the office chair, overwhelmed by the realization that everything she'd believed about her father's last months was wrong. He hadn't been a naive businessman deceived by a smooth-talking fraud. He'd been a deliberate operative in a dangerous investigation that had cost him his life and his reputation. The portfolio also contained a map marked with properties the conspiracy had targeted, including several ranches that were still operating successfully. Clara recognized some of the names, neighbors who'd expressed sympathy after her father's death, while secretly believing he'd brought his troubles on himself through poor judgment. One name on the map made her blood run cold: Callahan Ranch. According to her father's notes, Beau's operation was scheduled to be the next major target, using methods that would make his resistance look like obstruction of legitimate railroad development. The timeline suggested the attack should have begun months ago, but something had delayed their plans. Clara was still staring at the map when she heard horses approaching the main house. Through the office window, she could see 3 riders in the gathering dusk, moving with the purposeful pace of men on urgent business. Her first instinct was to hide the documents, but instead, she left them spread across the desk and walked outside to meet her visitors. The lead rider was a man she didn't recognize, well-dressed and obviously accustomed to authority. The other 2 wore the practical clothing of working cowboys, but their hands rested casually near their sidearms in a way that suggested they weren't employed for their expertise with cattle. "Miss Dunning?" The leader dismounted with practiced ease. "I'm District Attorney William Sterling. I believe you received correspondence from my associate regarding alternative opportunities." Clara kept her expression neutral despite the shock of recognition. Sterling was the second name on the law firm letterhead: Whitman, Sterling, and Associates. "Mr. Sterling, I wasn't expecting a personal visit. Sometimes personal attention is necessary when matters reach a certain level of importance." Sterling's smile was professionally charming, but didn't reach his eyes. "I hope you don't mind my calling unannounced, but I was in the area on other business and thought we might discuss your situation face to face." "What situation would that be?" "The unfortunate position you've placed yourself in by accepting employment that conflicts with legitimate territorial development interests." The phrase legitimate territorial development confirmed what Clara had begun to suspect from her father's documents. Sterling wasn't just representing the Denver organization, he was part of the territorial government structure that enabled their operations. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand what you mean by conflicting interests." "Miss Dunning, the Morrison Ranch sits directly in the path of crucial infrastructure development that will benefit the entire territory. Your presence here as an unauthorized manager complicates legal processes that have been months in preparation." Clara felt a cold certainty settle over her as she realized Sterling's visit wasn't a negotiation. It was a final warning before more direct action. Unauthorized by whom? By the Territorial Development Authority, which has eminent domain jurisdiction over properties required for public infrastructure projects. And if I refuse to recognize that authority? Sterling's companions shifted slightly in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons. "Then you'll be removed as an impediment to legitimate government business." "I see." Clara looked past Sterling toward the hills where Beau's ranch lay hidden in darkness. "And what happens to people who try to warn others about these legitimate government business activities?" Sterling's expression hardened. "People who interfere with territorial development projects sometimes suffer unfortunate accidents. Ranching is dangerous work, especially for those who lack proper experience." The threat was delivered with bureaucratic precision, but Clara heard the menace beneath the professional language. Sterling was telling her exactly what had happened to her father, and what would happen to her if she didn't cooperate. "Mr. Sterling, I appreciate you taking the time to explain the situation so clearly. It helps me understand exactly what kind of people I'm dealing with. I hope it also helps you understand the wisdom of accepting our alternative arrangement. You could be on a train to San Francisco tomorrow morning with enough money to start a new life far from these complications." Clara looked back toward the ranch house where her father's documents waited on the office desk. "I'll certainly consider your offer carefully." "Don't take too long, Miss Dunning. Some opportunities have very brief windows of availability." After Sterling and his men rode away, Clara returned to the office and gathered her father's papers with shaking hands. She finally understood why Morrison and Beau had been so careful in their approach to her, why the Morrison Ranch was so important to their plans, and why accepting the position had made her an immediate target. Her father hadn't died of a broken heart after losing his ranch. He'd been murdered for getting too close to the truth about a conspiracy that reached from Denver boardrooms to the territorial capital. And now Clara held the evidence he'd died trying to preserve. The compass in her pocket spun wildly as her hands trembled, but when she steadied herself and looked at it directly, its needle pointed not toward any geographic direction, but toward the locked drawer where she'd hidden her father's Colt revolver, the one gift he'd insisted she learn to use properly. "A Dunning always knows which direction they're heading," she whispered to the empty room, "even when the trail gets rough." For the first time since accepting the Morrison position, Clara understood she wasn't just managing a ranch or even fighting a legal battle. She was continuing an investigation that had already cost her father his life, and finishing it might cost her own. But it might also be the only way to ensure that his death meant something more than just another victory for people who believed power made them untouchable. Clara didn't sleep that night. She sat in the ranch house kitchen with her father's revolver on the table beside his portfolio, watching the approaches to the property through windows she'd left deliberately unshuttered. Sterling's visit had been a final warning, and she had no illusions about what would happen when the sun rose and she was still there. By lamplight, she studied every document her father had collected, trying to understand the full scope of what he'd uncovered. The conspiracy was even more extensive than Morrison and Beau had realized, involving not just land fraud, but systematic corruption of territorial government for the benefit of railroad interests with connections to federal legislators. Her father's notes included names, dates, and specific transactions that proved coordination between supposedly independent entities. He'd documented how fraudulent legal settlements were approved by compromised judges, how Territorial Development Authority was misused to justify seizures that benefited private interests, and how federal railroad surveys were altered to create artificial necessity for specific land acquisitions. Most importantly, he'd identified the federal investigator he'd planned to meet, Deputy Marshal Samuel Fletcher, who was secretly documenting territorial corruption as part of a larger federal investigation into railroad fraud. Fletcher was based in Cheyenne, but her father's notes indicated he'd been planning to travel to Sweetwater under cover of routine territorial business. Clara found Fletcher's business card tucked into the portfolio's back pocket, along with a train schedule marked with arrival times. Her father had expected to hand over his evidence on September 15, 1884, the morning after he died quietly in his chair, supposedly of natural causes. The federal investigator had arrived on schedule, but there had been no one alive to meet with him. Fletcher had probably returned to Cheyenne, believing his contact had lost courage or been compromised, unaware that Thomas Dunning had died, trying to preserve evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. Clara made her decision as the first pale light of dawn appeared over the eastern hills. She couldn't wait for Sterling to return with more definitive action, and she couldn't assume Beau and Morrison would be able to protect her indefinitely. If she was going to complete her father's work, she needed to get his evidence to Deputy Marshal Fletcher before the conspiracy silenced her permanently. But first, she needed to ensure the evidence would survive, even if she didn't. Clara spent the early morning hours making multiple copies of the most important documents, using the ranch office's carbon paper and typewriter to create duplicates she could hide in different locations. She sealed one complete set in an oilskin pouch and buried it beneath the stone foundation of the main house, marking the location with scratches that would be invisible unless someone knew where to look. Another set went into a second oilskin pouch that she hid in the old well behind the foreman's house, lowered to a depth where it would remain dry even if the well was used again. The original documents she kept with her, along with her father's notes and the federal investigator's contact information. As she worked, Clara found herself thinking about the courage it must have taken for her father to risk everything on an investigation that could only succeed if he was willing to lose his ranch in the process. He'd sacrificed his reputation, his fortune, and ultimately his life to gather evidence against people who considered themselves above the law. The least she could do was ensure his sacrifice wasn't wasted. Clara was saddling her horse when she heard riders approaching from the south. Too many horses moving too fast to represent anything other than trouble. She counted at least 6 men riding hard toward the ranch with the purposeful urgency of people who'd received specific instructions about timing and objectives. Instead of running, Clara finished preparing her horse and secured her father's portfolio in her saddlebags along with supplies for a hard ride to Cheyenne. If Sterling had come back with reinforcements, she wanted them to find her ready to travel rather than cowering in the ranch house like a trapped animal. The riders crested the rise overlooking the main buildings with military precision, spreading out to surround the house before approaching the front yard. Sterling was in the lead again, but this time he was accompanied by men wearing territorial marshal badges, along with their sidearms. "Miss Dunning," Sterling called as he dismounted. "I'm sorry to disturb you so early, but we have legal business that can't wait for more civilized hours." Clara stepped onto the front porch, keeping her hands visible but close to the revolver at her hip. "What kind of legal business?" "A territorial court has issued an injunction against unauthorized occupation of this property. You're required to vacate immediately." "On what grounds?" Sterling produced an official-looking document from his coat pocket. "Interference with eminent domain proceedings related to territorial infrastructure development." Clara didn't need to read the injunction to know it was legally worthless. A territorial court had no authority to override property ownership without federal approval. And D.T. Morrison deed was valid under federal law. But Sterling wasn't interested in legal technicalities. He was interested in removing her from the property before she could cause more trouble for his organization. "I'll need to review that injunction with my legal counsel before I can respond appropriately," I'm afraid there's no time for counsel. The injunction requires immediate compliance. One of the territorial marshals moved his horse closer to the porch. Ma'am, it would be best if you gathered your belongings quickly and came with us. We can provide safe transport to town while the legal matters are resolved. Clara recognized the offer for what it was. A chance to disappear quietly without forcing Sterling to take more dramatic action in front of witnesses. If she got on a horse with these men, she'd never reach Sweetwater alive. Gentlemen, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I'm perfectly capable of arranging my own transportation. Sterling's expression hardened. Miss Dunning, this isn't a negotiation. You're interfering with legitimate territorial business, and that interference will be stopped by whatever means necessary. And if I refuse to recognize the authority of an injunction issued without proper jurisdiction, then you'll be removed as a trespasser and taken into custody for obstruction of territorial development projects. Clara looked at the men surrounding her property. 6 armed representatives of corrupted territorial authority operating under legal cover that would make their actions appear legitimate to anyone who didn't understand the true situation. Even if she tried to explain what was really happening, who would believe that territorial marshals were acting on behalf of a private conspiracy? But her father's documents provided answers to that question, too. He'd identified specific federal laws that prohibited territorial authorities from seizing property without federal oversight, and he documented how those laws were being violated systematically. If she could get his evidence to Deputy Marshal Fletcher, the federal government would have grounds to investigate not just the land fraud, but the territorial officials who enabled it. Mr. Sterling, I understand your position, but I think there are federal authorities who might view this situation differently. Sterling's face went pale. What federal authorities? The kind who investigate territorial corruption and railroad fraud. The kind my father was planning to meet with before his untimely death. The silence that followed Clara's words was thick with tension. Sterling's men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to their weapons as they realized this confrontation had just become significantly more complicated. Miss Dunning, Sterling said carefully, I think you're confused about your father's activities before his death. Thomas Dunning was a failed rancher who died of natural causes after making poor business decisions. Thomas Dunning was a federal informant gathering evidence about territorial corruption, and you killed him to stop him from exposing your conspiracy. Sterling's hand moved toward his coat, but before he could draw whatever weapon he carried, the sound of approaching horses came from the north, another group of riders moving fast toward the ranch. Clara felt a surge of relief as she recognized Beau's voice shouting instructions to his men. He'd brought what sounded like a full crew of cowboys, and they were positioning themselves strategically around the property boundaries. Sterling, Beau's voice carried clearly across the yard. You're trespassing on private property with falsified legal documents. Sterling turned his horse to face this new threat, his territorial marshals forming a defensive line between themselves and Beau's approaching cowboys. Callahan, this is territorial business. Interfere at your own risk. The only risk here is to men who think territorial badges give them authority to commit murder on private property. Clara realized this was her chance. While Sterling's attention was focused on the confrontation with Beau, she could mount her horse and make a run for the tree line behind the main house. Once she reached cover, she might be able to work her way around to where Beau's men were positioned. But as she stepped toward her horse, one of Sterling's marshals turned his attention back to her. Ma'am, step away from that animal and return to the house. I don't think so, Clara said quietly, and drew her father's revolver. The marshal's eyes widened as he found himself looking down the barrel of a Colt .45, held in steady hands. Clara had spent countless hours practicing with the weapon her father insisted she learn to use, and her stance made it clear she knew exactly how to employ it effectively. Gentlemen, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, you came here to remove an impediment to your conspiracy, but I think you've discovered that removing a Dunning is more difficult than you anticipated. Sterling spun his horse back toward her, his face twisted with rage and fear. "You're making a terrible mistake, Miss Dunning." "No, Mr. Sterling, the terrible mistake was made 3 years ago when you murdered my father. Today, I'm going to make sure that mistake costs you everything." Clara mounted her horse without lowering her weapon, keeping Sterling and his men covered while she settled into the saddle. Behind her, she could hear Beau's cowboys taking positions that would give them clear fields of fire if the situation escalated to violence. "This isn't over," Sterling said. "No," Clara agreed, turning her horse toward the path that would take her to Cheyenne and Deputy Marshal Fletcher. "But it's about to be." As she spurred her horse toward the tree line, Clara heard Sterling shouting orders to his men. But whether they were instructions to pursue her or to withdraw in the face of superior numbers, she didn't stay to find out. Her father's compass spun wildly in her pocket as her horse jumped fallen logs and navigated rough terrain, but Clara didn't need mechanical guidance anymore. She knew exactly which direction she was heading. The ride to Cheyenne normally took 2 days, but Clara pushed her horse hard through terrain that would challenge experienced cavalry. She knew Sterling's men would be following, and she knew they wouldn't hesitate to kill her if they caught her before she reached federal protection. By noon, she'd put 15 miles between herself and the Morrison Ranch, following old cattle trails through rough country where horses left fewer tracks and riders could disappear into broken landscape that favored defenders over pursuers. Her father had taught her these trails during hunting trips when she was younger, explaining how knowledge of the land was more valuable than speed when avoiding trouble. Clara stopped only long enough to rest her horse and check her back trail, scanning the horizon for dust clouds that would indicate pursuit. She saw nothing, but that didn't mean she was safe. Sterling's men knew this territory too, and they had resources she couldn't match if the chase became a prolonged affair. The federal marshal's office in Cheyenne occupied the second floor of a substantial brick building on 16th Street, its windows providing clear views of the railway station where territorial officials conducted much of their legitimate business. Clara had been there once before with her father, years ago when he'd needed federal documentation for a boundary dispute with neighboring ranches. Deputy Marshal Fletcher proved to be a compact man in his 40s with observant eyes, and the careful manner of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. He listened without interruptions as Clara explained who she was and why she'd ridden hard from Sweetwater with documents that couldn't wait for normal business hours. "Miss Dunning," Fletcher said after she'd finished her initial explanation, "your father was supposed to meet with me 3 years ago. When he failed to appear, I assumed he'd lost courage or been compromised. He was murdered the night before your scheduled meeting." Fletcher's expression didn't change, but Clara noticed his hands go very still on his desk. "That's a serious accusation. Do you have evidence to support it?" Clara opened her father's portfolio and spread its contents across Fletcher's desk. The letters, the investigative notes, the maps marked with targeted properties, and the documentation of systematic fraud that had cost her family everything. Fletcher studied each document carefully, occasionally making notes or asking specific questions about dates and locations. Clara watched his face grow increasingly grim as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. "This is extensive work," Fletcher observed. "Your father had been investigating this organization for months. He knew it was dangerous, but he believed exposing them was worth the risk. And now you're taking the same risk by bringing this evidence to federal attention." Clara met his eyes steadily. "They've already taken everything they could from me through legal fraud. The only thing left they can take is my life, and I'd rather lose it fighting than spend it hiding." Fletcher closed the portfolio and looked at Clara with something that might have been respect. "Miss Dunning, what you've brought me provides grounds for a federal investigation into territorial corruption, but it doesn't necessarily prove your father was murdered." "What would prove it?" "Testimony from someone involved in the conspiracy who's willing to provide evidence in exchange for federal protection." Clara felt her heart sink. "And how would we find someone like that?" Fletcher smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him. "We wouldn't find them, Miss Dunning. We'd make them come to us." "How?" "By giving them something they want badly enough to take risks they shouldn't take." Clara stared at the federal marshal as understanding began to dawn. "You want to use me as bait?" "I want to use the fact that you now possess evidence they can't afford to let reach federal prosecutors. They'll have to act against you directly, and when they do, we'll be ready to document their criminal behavior in ways that will hold up in federal court." "And if they succeed in killing me before you can document anything?" "They won't succeed, because you won't be alone when they make their attempt." Fletcher stood up and moved to a cabinet that contained what appeared to be official correspondence. "Miss Dunning, how would you feel about becoming a temporary federal deputy for the purpose of this investigation?" Clara blinked in surprise. "I don't understand." "Federal deputies have authority to investigate territorial corruption and to defend themselves against interference with that investigation. If you're willing to continue your father's work under federal protection, I can provide you with credentials that will make attacking you a federal crime rather than just murder." "What would that involve?" "Returning to Sweetwater with evidence that the conspiracy has been exposed, letting them know you've provided federal authorities with documentation of their activities, and waiting for them to make mistakes that will give us grounds for arrests." Clara thought about Sterling's threats, about the territorial marshals with their falsified documents, about all the people in Sweetwater who had no idea they were living at the mercy of a conspiracy that viewed them as obstacles to profit. "Deputy Marshal Fletcher, if I accept this arrangement and something goes wrong, if they manage to kill me despite federal protection, what happens to the evidence?" "It goes to federal prosecutors regardless. Your father's work will be completed whether you survive to see justice done or not." Clara picked up her father's compass from the desk where she'd set it beside the portfolio. Its needle pointed steadily toward magnetic north, unwavering despite the momentous decisions being made around it. "A Dunning always knows which direction they're heading," she said quietly. "Even when the trail gets rough?" Clara looked up at Fletcher and smiled. "Especially then." "Then welcome to the Federal Marshal Service, Deputy Dunning." Clara returned to Sweetwater 3 days later, wearing a federal deputy's badge and carrying official documentation that made her investigation a matter of federal interest rather than local concern. Fletcher had insisted she travel with 2 additional federal agents posing as cowboys seeking ranch work, their presence intended to provide protection while maintaining the appearance that Clara was acting alone. The entire town seemed to sense that something significant was about to happen. Conversation stopped when Clara rode down Main Street, and she noticed several people hurrying indoors as if her presence represented some form of contagion they preferred to avoid. Mrs. Henderson met Clara at the door of her general store with obvious nervousness. "Miss Dunning, I heard you'd left the territory entirely. People said you'd accepted employment elsewhere." "People heard wrong. I've accepted different employment, but it's right here in Sweetwater." "What kind of employment?" Clara showed her the federal badge. "The kind that investigates territorial corruption and protects citizens from criminal conspiracy." Mrs. Henderson's face went pale. "Clara, what have you gotten yourself involved in?" "Justice for my father and protection for everyone else in this town who's vulnerable to the same forces that destroyed my family." Clara spent the afternoon visiting businesses and homes throughout Sweetwater, informing residents that federal authorities were investigating systematic fraud targeting ranch owners, and that anyone with information about suspicious legal activities should contact her directly. She made no attempt to hide her purpose or downplay the seriousness of the situation. By evening, word of her activities had spread throughout the community and beyond. Clara knew Sterling would hear about her return within hours, and she expected him to respond quickly once he understood the threat her federal credentials represented to his organization's operations. She didn't have to wait long. Clara was reviewing her father's documents in the ranch office when she heard horses approaching from multiple directions. Through the windows, she could see riders surrounding the property with the systematic precision of a military operation. This time, Sterling had brought more than territorial marshals. She counted at least a dozen men, and several wore the uniforms of federal land commissioners. Fletcher's agents were positioned in the timber north of the main house, close, enough to provide support, but far enough away to avoid being trapped if the situation turned violent. Clara had no way to signal them without revealing their presence, so she would have to trust their training and judgment about when to intervene. Sterling dismounted in the front yard with the confidence of someone who believed he held overwhelming advantage. "Deputy Dunning," he called, his voice carrying mockery that made the federal title sound like an insult. "I understand you've been spreading unfortunate rumors about legitimate territorial business." Clara stepped onto the front porch with her father's revolver visible on her hip and her federal badge clearly displayed on her shirt. "I've been informing citizens about federal investigation into criminal conspiracy. If you consider that spreading rumors, perhaps you should examine your own activities more carefully. Miss Dunning, you're interfering with legal territorial development projects that have federal approval. Your accusations are not only false, they're potentially treasonous. Then I'm sure you'll be happy to present your federal authorization documents for review by federal authorities." Sterling's expression hardened as he realized Clara wasn't going to be intimidated by official titles or superior numbers. "You're making the same mistake your father made. Some battles can't be won by stubborn people who refuse to accept reality." "What reality is that, Mr. Sterling?" "The reality that certain territorial development projects are more important than individual property rights, and that people who interfere with those projects face serious consequences." Clara pulled her father's portfolio from inside her coat and held it where Sterling could see it clearly. "You mean consequences like being murdered for gathering evidence about criminal conspiracy? Your father died of natural causes after making poor business decisions. My father was murdered because he discovered that territorial officials were accepting bribes to facilitate illegal land seizures for railroad interests. He was killed because he had evidence that could send federal commissioners to prison for corruption and treason." Sterling's hand moved toward his weapon, but stopped when Clara continued speaking. "That evidence is now in the possession of federal prosecutors in Cheyenne. Killing me won't stop the investigation. It will only add murder of a federal officer to the charges you're already facing." The yard fell silent, except for the sound of wind moving through the trees where Fletcher's agents waited. Sterling's men were beginning to look uncomfortable as they realized they might be participating in something that could bring federal attention none of them wanted. "Miss Dunning," Sterling said carefully, "you're bluffing. No federal prosecutor would proceed with charges based on 3-year-old documents from a dead man." Clara smiled and reached into her pocket. "Perhaps not, but they might proceed based on this." She pulled out a small recording device Fletcher had given her, new technology that could capture conversations for use as evidence in federal court. The device had been running since Sterling's arrival, documenting every word he'd said about territorial development projects and the consequences faced by people who interfered with them. Sterling stared at the recording device with the expression of someone who had just realized he'd walked into a trap that would destroy everything he'd worked to build. "Gentlemen," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard, "you're all under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and accessory to murder." That's when the shooting started. The gunfight lasted less than 5 minutes, but those minutes changed everything for Sweetwater and the surrounding territory. Sterling's first shot shattered a porch post inches from Clara's head. But before he could fire again, Fletcher's agents emerged from the timber with federal authority and superior positioning. What Sterling had intended as intimidation became evidence of criminal assault on a federal officer. What his men had believed was routine enforcement of territorial authority became participation in a conspiracy that would destroy their careers and their freedom. 3 of Sterling's men surrendered immediately when they realized federal agents were present. 2 others tried to escape and were captured before they could reach their horses. Sterling himself fought until a bullet from one of Fletcher's agents ended his career in territorial corruption permanently. Clara spent the rest of that evening giving statements to federal investigators who arrived from Cheyenne on the next train. The recording device had captured not only Sterling's incriminating words, but also clear evidence of conspiracy involving federal land commissioners who had exceeded their authority for personal profit. Within a week, arrests were being made in Denver, Cheyenne, and Washington. The railroad fraud investigation expanded to include similar operations in Colorado and Montana, ultimately exposing a network of corruption that reached from territorial offices to congressional committees responsible for railroad regulation. The trials began 6 months later and continued for nearly 2 years. Clara testified in Denver, Cheyenne, and Washington, her father's documents and her own recording, providing evidence that sent 11 men to federal prison and cost dozens of others their positions in territorial and federal government. The Morrison Ranch prospered under Clara's management, though success came slowly and required assistance from neighbors who had once treated her with indifferent politeness. Beau Callahan proved to be not just an ally, but a partner in ways that extended beyond the shared danger they'd faced together. Their wedding took place on a warm September morning 2 years after the trials ended, in the same church where Clara had decided to accept the Morrison opportunity. Reverend Patterson officiated, and the congregation included many of the same people who had once treated Clara as invisible hired help, but the guest who mattered most to Clara wasn't present in person. Before the ceremony, she had visited her father's grave and left his brass compass on the headstone, its needle pointing steadily north toward the land she'd reclaimed and the future she'd built from the ashes of everything she'd lost. A Dunning always knows which direction they're heading, she whispered to the weathered stone that bore her father's name. Even when the trail gets rough. Clara kept her position as a federal deputy, though her duties focused on preventing the kind of fraud that had once threatened the entire territory, rather than investigating crimes after they'd already caused damage. The federal government had learned valuable lessons about the need for oversight of territorial development, and Clara's experience made her uniquely qualified to recognize warning signs that others might miss. The Denver conspiracy had collapsed completely, but its destruction created opportunities for legitimate development that benefited everyone in the territory. Railroad construction proceeded under proper federal oversight, with land acquisitions conducted transparently and compensation provided fairly to property owners. Clara's success as the Morrison Ranch manager led to consulting opportunities with other ranchers who wanted to modernize their operations without falling prey to fraudulent schemes. She discovered a talent for organizing cooperative ventures that allowed smaller operations to compete effectively with larger enterprises, and her reputation for honest dealing made her a trusted advisor throughout the territory. The main house at the Morrison Ranch was eventually restored to its full grandeur, but Clara and Beau continued to live in the foreman's residence. They'd grown attached to its practical layout and strategic location, and both preferred the intimacy of smaller spaces to the formal grandeur of rooms designed for entertaining territorial officials. On quiet evenings, Clara often sat in the ranch office where she'd first discovered her father's hidden portfolio. The leather folder remained on her desk, its documents now preserved as historical evidence of the corruption that had once threatened the territory's development. Sometimes she read through her father's careful notes, marveling at his courage in pursuing an investigation that he'd known would cost him everything he'd built. He'd chosen justice over safety, truth over comfort, and the future welfare of his community over his own immediate interests. Clara had made the same choice, though with advantages her father hadn't possessed: federal support, reliable allies, and knowledge of her enemy's methods and capabilities. Her success hadn't erased the pain of losing him, but it had given meaning to his sacrifice that made his death something more than just another victory for people who believed power made them untouchable. 3 years after the trials ended, Clara stood in the yard of the ranch that had become her home, watching cowboys work cattle descended from herds her father had once raised on land that had been stolen and then reclaimed. The circle had closed, but not perfectly. Some things that were lost could never be fully recovered, but other things could be built anew, stronger and more resilient than what had come before. The territorial government had been reformed with new oversight procedures that made future conspiracy much more difficult to accomplish. The railroad had been completed with proper federal supervision, bringing prosperity to communities that had once been vulnerable to exploitation. And Clara had proven that sometimes the biggest risk was not taking any risk at all. As the sun set over land that would remain in Dunning hands for generations to come, Clara pulled her father's compass from her pocket one last time. Its needle pointed steadily north, toward mountains that marked the edge of the known world and the beginning of whatever adventures lay beyond the horizon. She was Thomas Dunning's daughter, and she finally knew exactly which direction she was heading.